The morning they read my father's will, the fellowship hall at Mount Olive still smelled like funeral flowers gone brown at the edges, a smell like sugar turning sour in the heat. I sat in a metal folding chair at the end of the row, hands folded in my lap the way my father taught me when I was 7 and didn't know how to sit still in church. My stepmother, Deborah Calloway, sat up front in black lace, dabbing at eyes that hadn't produced one tear at the actual funeral. Her son Marcus checked his phone under the table. Her daughter Renee sat with her arms crossed, already dressed for somewhere better. The lawyer, Mr. Pruitt, read through the house first. That went to Deborah. The truck went to Marcus. The savings account went to Renee, for her education, though she'd been out of school 6 years. Then he reached my name. To my daughter, Nadine, he paused there, like even he thought there should be more following it. I leave the contents of my workshop, all tools inside it, and the vessel currently stored beneath the tarp behind the shed. Silence. Then Marcus laughed, short and ugly. A boat? Man left her a broken boat. I didn't answer. In that family, silence had always cost less than argument. But something in my chest went still and awake, the way it does right before you understand a thing you don't yet have words for. Because I remembered that boat. I remembered my father sanding its hull by lantern light years back, humming low under his breath, refusing to tell even Deborah what it was for. I remembered how he'd stop working the second footsteps came near, covering the wood the way a man covers a letter he isn't ready for anyone to read. Everyone in that room heard an insult. An old boat. A box of rusted tools. Nothing worth fighting over. I heard my father, for the first time in years, trying to tell me something. I did not know yet it would take a sealed county document, an old man's failing memory, and one nearly forgotten tradition to understand what that something was, or why, every time he looked at me alone, without another soul in the room. My father used to smile like a man who had gotten away with something wonderful. My name is Nadine Calloway, and I have spent most of my 34 years being reminded, gently and not so gently, that I was lucky to carry that name at all. I was 7 when my mother died on St. Helena Island, in a house 2 streets from the marsh, where the air smelled of pluff mud and low tide. James Calloway wasn't my blood father. He was the man my mother married when I was 4, a quiet botryte with sawdust ground into the lines of his palms. Nobody expected him to keep me after she passed. His own sister said so, at the funeral, in a voice she thought I couldn't hear. He kept me anyway. He drove downtown, stood before a judge, and made it legal, made it his choice, not an accident of timing. 3 years later, he married Deborah, who brought Marcus and Renee, and I learned a new arithmetic in that house. Blood counted more than years. Our children meant the 2 of them. James's girl meant me. I was fed, clothed, sent to school. I'll be fair about that much. But every decision shaping my life, where I'd go to college, whether to take a scholarship 2 states away, who I would or wouldn't marry, got settled at a table I wasn't always asked to sit at, by people who reminded me, whenever I pushed back. How fortunate I was that James bothered with me at all. Only in the shop was it different. Out behind the house, past the fig tree, my father kept a workshop with a tin roof that sang when it rained and a floor soft with 40 years of cedar shavings. He'd disappear out there most evenings, and some nights, without saying I could come, he'd leave the door cracked. I'd sit on an overturned bucket while he worked, saying almost nothing, and he'd look up sometimes, just me, nobody else around, and smile like I was the answer to a question he'd carried a long time. I never asked what that smile meant. I assumed, the way children assume things, I'd have time to ask. I did not have time. But I'd come to understand it was never really about me. It was about a promise, and about wood, and about a tradition our whole family had quietly let die. Are you enjoying the story? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you're enjoying it so far, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because believe me, this story is only getting started. Now let's get back into it. The week after the will was read, I drove out to the shop alone, before sunrise, the way my father used to. Low-tide fog sat over the marsh grass like a held breath. The shed door stuck the way it always had, and when I finally pulled the tarp off what he'd left me, I stood there a long time just looking. It wasn't a rowboat exactly. It was a dugout canoe, nearly 14 feet, hollowed from a single cypress log the old way almost nobody built them anymore. The wood had silvered and cracked in places, but the deep, patient curve of the hull was unmistakably his hand. I ran my fingers along a rail he'd carved with small crosses, and something in me recognized it before my mind caught up. I had seen this shape once, in a photograph tucked inside my grandmother's Bible, of black church folks standing waist-deep in a creek beside a boat just like this one, waiting to be baptized. Praise boats. Gullah families along this coast once used hand-carved dugouts to carry elders and children out to baptize in the creek when the water ran too deep or muddy to wade. My father never once mentioned building one. But here it sat, half-finished, patient, waiting on him to come back and never getting the chance. In the toolbox he'd left me, beneath the chisels, I found a folded photograph and a name written on the back in his handwriting, Isaiah Grant, 1979. I asked around the fish market until someone pointed me toward a low blue house near the causeway, and there he was, Mr. Isaiah, 91 years old, sitting on his porch shelling peas like he had all the time God ever made. "You James's girl," he said before I'd introduced myself. Not a question. "Yes, sir." He studied me a long moment, eyes pale with cataracts, but sharp underneath them. "He finally start that boat? You knew about it?" Mr. Isaiah set his bowl down slow, like the memory cost him something. "Girl," he said, "your daddy and I built the last one of these together 40 years ago. Everybody said the tradition was already dead by then. He never could let it go." I didn't know yet that Mr. Isaiah's memory and mine were about to become the only two things standing between that boat and the county's bulldozers. Mr. Isaiah agreed to teach me, though he made it clear he thought I'd quit inside a week. "We don't care about your feelings," he told me that first morning, handing me an adze heavier than anything I'd held in my life. "It only care if your hands know what they're doing." Mine didn't, not at first. I split a plank I'd spent 3 hours smoothing. I burned my palm raw before I learned to hold the draw knife at the right angle. I went home most nights smelling of cypress and sweat, my knuckles cracked, and I told no one at all, because I already knew what they'd say. Renee found out anyway. She drove past the shop one Saturday, windows down, and saw me out there in my father's old canvas apron, sawdust in my braids. She laughed before she even parked. "You really out here playing boat builder," she said, arms crossed the same way they'd been at the funeral. "Daddy left you scraps and you're grateful for scraps." "That's kind of sad, Nadine, not gonna lie." I kept sanding. I had learned a long time ago that Renee's opinion of me changed nothing about the truth of what I was holding in my hands. What did change things was a boy named Terrence, 11 years old, who lived 2 doors from Mr. Isaiah and started showing up uninvited, first just to watch, then to hand me tools, then, one Tuesday, to ask if he could try the draw knife himself. His mother worked 2 jobs and worried, she told me later, that he had nothing after school but a phone and an empty house. Out at the shop, he had something to do with his hands, and something to be proud of when it worked. By late spring, the hull was fair and true from bow to stern, sanded smooth as river stone, and Mr. Isaiah stood back one evening, hands on his hips, studying it the way a man studies an old friend's face. "Your daddy would have had this thing in the water by now," he said. Then, quieter, almost to himself, he always did work like he was racing something. Never would tell me what. I didn't know it yet, but he was racing time and a piece of paper sealed inside a filing cabinet at the Beaufort County Courthouse that even Mr. Isaiah didn't know existed. The letter came on a Thursday, forwarded from Deborah's lawyer, dressed up in language meant to sound gentler than what it was. The estate, the house, the land, the shed my father's workshop stood on had been listed for sale to a development company planning a row of vacation rentals along the causeway. Closing was set for the first week of August. 10 weeks away. I called Deborah before I'd even finished reading it twice. "It's my land to sell, Nadine," she said, calm as still water. "James left the property to me. He left you a boat and some tools. Don't twist that into something it isn't." "That shop is on that land," I said. "You're telling me you're going to let them bulldoze it with the boat still inside?" "I'm telling you," she said, "that grief makes people romantic about junk. That boat's not going to feed anybody." That land is. She wasn't wrong about the money. Deborah had never once, in all my life, been wrong about money, only about nearly everything else that mattered. And legally, as far as either of us knew, she was standing on solid ground. James Calloway's will, the one Mr. Pruitt had read aloud that morning at Mount Olive, left the property outright to his wife. I drove out to the shop that night and sat on the same overturned bucket I'd sat on as a girl, staring at a boat that suddenly had 10 weeks left to live, at most. Mr. Isaiah found me there past 10 o'clock, letting himself in without knocking the way old men do when they've earned it. "You look like your father the night your mama passed," he said, easing himself down onto a stool. Sat right there. Didn't say a word for 2 hours. "I honestly don't know what to do, Mr. Isaiah. I can't stop a sale. I don't have the money, and I don't have the legal standing." He was quiet a long while, turning something over behind those pale, careful eyes. "Your daddy wasn't a man who left things to chance, Nadine. Not with wood, not with people. If he handed you this boat and nothing else, I'd start wondering what else he handed you that you just ain't found yet." I didn't understand what he meant. Not that night. Not until I finally thought to look inside the boat itself. I went back the next afternoon and did what I should have done the first day. I actually looked, really looked, at the boat itself instead of just admiring it. I ran my hands along the inside of the hull, under the bow seat, along every rib, the way Mr. Isaiah had taught me to check for rot. Near the stern, one support rib sat slightly proud of the others, its grain running just a shade off from the wood around it. My father never made careless mistakes like that. Not in 40 years of boat building. If something looked wrong, it was wrong on purpose. I worked a thin blade under the edge of it, gently, the way you'd lift a scab you were afraid to disturb, and the rib came away whole, not structural at all, but a false panel. Hollowed out and fitted so precisely that only someone who knew my father's habits would ever think to check it. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth to keep out the damp, was a single sealed envelope, yellowed at the folds, and a folded note in his handwriting. "Nadine, if you're reading this, you finally looked past what people told you the boat was worth. That's the only kind of person who should have what's inside. Take the envelope to the Beaufort County Clerk of Court. Ask for the sealed supplemental filing under Calloway, James E. Don't let anyone open it but you." My hands were shaking by the time I reached the courthouse the next morning. The clerk, a heavy-set woman named Ms. Pauline with reading glasses on a beaded chain, typed the case number slowly, frowning at her screen. "This here's flagged," she said. "Sealed filing, condition-based release. Somebody has to verify identity and meet the conditions listed before it can be opened. That's unusual. Most sealed filings, we don't even see conditions like this." "What conditions?" She turned the monitor slightly, though she wasn't supposed to. "Says here, to be unsealed only upon presentation by the adopted daughter of the decedent, accompanied by sworn testimony from a named witness to the original 1979 vessel." I thought of Mr. Isaiah on his porch, shelling peas, telling me he'd built the last one of these with my father 40 years ago. My father hadn't just built a boat. He had built a lock and left me the only 2 keys. Miss Pauline turned out to be the kind of civil servant nobody thanks enough, patient, exact, quietly outraged on my behalf once she understood what she was looking at. She pulled a second file, older, yellowed at the corners, unrelated to the sealed envelope itself, my adoption decree from 1999, James Calloway's signature firm on every page, alongside a supplemental affidavit I never knew existed. "Your daddy didn't just adopt you," she said, sliding the papers across the counter so I could read them myself. "Read this part here." In it, in language so formal it almost hid what it meant, my father had sworn before a judge that he intended, upon completion of a vessel then under construction, to convey a specific parcel of the family land, the shed, the workshop, and the shoreline access behind it, to me directly, outside the general estate, contingent on that vessel's completion and one public ceremonial launch. The filing had been sealed at his own request, to protect it, Ms. Pauline guessed, from exactly the kind of dispute now sitting on Deborah's desk. "He built himself insurance," she said, tapping the page twice. "In case somebody ever tried to quietly erase you after he was gone. I called the number on Deborah's lawyer's letterhead that same afternoon, hands steadier than I expected, and told them what I'd found. Their response came fast and cold. The filing would need to be formally verified in probate court, contested if necessary, and given the pending sale, they intended to challenge its validity the moment I filed. I had their letter estimated roughly 6 weeks before the closing date made the whole question academic. A demolished shed makes for a very simple legal argument. 6 weeks to finish a boat that had sat unfinished for years. 6 weeks to get a 91-year-old man's testimony on record before a judge who might not sit again until fall. 6 weeks to convince a courtroom that a half-forgotten tradition, and the love behind it, was worth more than a signed contract. I drove straight to Mr. Isaiah's porch that evening, papers still in hand, and found him asleep in his chair with the peas still in his lap, breathing slower than I liked. For the first time since the funeral, I understood that I wasn't only racing Deborah's lawyer. I was racing time itself on 2 fronts at once. Mr. Isaiah's stroke came 3 days later, mild enough to spare his mind, but strong enough to steal his balance and slur the right side of his speech. I sat in a hospital hallway that smelled of antiseptic and bad coffee, listening to his niece explain, gently, that testifying anytime soon simply wasn't going to happen. I won't pretend I didn't think, for one ugly moment, about the closing date. I hated myself instantly. Then I went in and sat with him, held his good hand, and told him none of it mattered as much as him getting better. I meant it. But driving home that night, alone on the causeway with the marsh going dark on both sides, I let myself cry the way I hadn't at my father's funeral, not for the land, not for the deadline, but for how much of this I might have to finish without either of them beside me. Deborah's lawyer filed the challenge that same week, calling my claim a last-minute attempt to derail a lawful estate sale using a sentimental heirloom. Renee texted once, unprompted, "Hope your little boat project was worth losing the house over." I didn't answer. I'd stopped needing her to understand. What I hadn't expected was Terrence's mother showing up at the shop that Saturday with a casserole and her sister and 2 cousins, saying Mr. Isaiah had told half the church about James's girl finishing what he started, and folks wanted to help however they could. By the following weekend, 6 of us worked out there most evenings, an electrician who knew nothing about boats, but was handy with a sander, a retired teacher who kept notes on everything Mr. Isaiah remembered when he was well enough to visit and talk us through a technique from his hospital bed, Terrence sworn in as official keeper of the tools. I understood something out there, standing by lantern light the way my father once had, that no lawyer's letter could touch. This had stopped being only my inheritance. It had become something the whole community was quietly, stubbornly refusing to let disappear, the same way, I realized, my father had refused to let it disappear for 30 years before I ever picked up a tool. Some things survive not because one person is strong enough to save them alone, but because enough people simply refuse to let go. The probate hearing landed 9 days before closing, in a courtroom smelling of floor wax and old paper. Mr. Isaiah insisted on coming, against doctor's advice, wheeled in by his niece, his right hand still curled but his mind entirely his own. Deborah's attorney argued first, calling the sealed filing a convenient discovery and questioning whether a 91-year-old man's memory of a 40-year-old boat could meet any reasonable evidentiary standard. Then it was Mr. Isaiah's turn. He wouldn't let his niece speak for him. He gripped the wheelchair's arms, pulled himself upright as his body allowed, and spoke slow, deliberate, each word costing visible effort. "James Calloway and I built a boat in 1979, he said. Wasn't for money. Wasn't for show. Built it so this island's children could still be baptized the old way, in the water, like our grandmothers were. When his wife passed and he took in this child, he nodded toward me, and the room shifted its attention, he told me, right there in that shop. He was going to build one more. Said he wanted the girl to have something nobody could take from her just by outnumbering her at a table. I called that foolish sentiment. He said foolish sentiment was the only thing that ever kept our people's traditions alive at all. The judge, a quiet woman with silver-streaked locks, asked to see the boat before ruling. We brought her to the shore 2 days later, along with Deborah, Marcus, Renee, Terrence's family, half of Mount Olive, and a crowd of neighbors who'd heard by word of mouth that something worth witnessing was happening down by the causeway. I read my father's letter aloud before we launched her, my voice cracking on the words about being the answer to a question he'd carried a long time. Renee, standing at the back with her arms uncrossed for once, was already crying by the second paragraph. The judge ruled from the shore that afternoon, informally at first, formally the following week. The filing was valid, its conditions met, the land and shop conveyed to me as my father intended. But nobody in that crowd thought about deeds when Terrence, Mr. Isaiah, and I eased the dugout into the water and watched, for the first time in over 40 years, a praise boat carry our people into the creek exactly as it was always meant to. A year has passed since that afternoon on the shore, and the shed my father built still stands, though it looks different now. We call it Callaway Boatworks. Most Saturdays you'll find 8 or 9 kids there with Terrence, now 12 and insufferably proud of his title as head apprentice, teaching younger ones to hold a draw knife the way Mr. Isaiah taught me. Mr. Isaiah comes by most weeks, slower now, leaning on a cane, sharp as ever, correcting our angles from a folding chair he refuses to give up. I didn't keep the land for myself in the end. I couldn't, once I understood what it was for. We formed a small nonprofit instead, deeded the shop and shoreline to a community trust, so no single person's decision, mine included, could ever again put this place at the mercy of one signature. Deborah didn't come to the dedication. Renee did. She stood in the back again, the way she had at the launch, but this time stayed until the end, and afterward asked, quietly, if it was too late to learn. It wasn't. It still isn't. That's the thing about tradition. It dies only once the last person who cares stops looking for someone to hand it to. I think often about the smile my father used to give me, alone in that shop, before I understood any of it. I know now it wasn't pity, nor guilt over being unable to give me more. It was recognition. He saw, long before I did, that I was the one who noticed the boat under the tarp instead of walking past it, the one who sat quiet on a bucket instead of leaving, the one who would eventually look long enough to actually see. Maybe you have something like that in your own life right now, an old skill somebody tried teaching you that you brushed off, a relative's habit dismissed as outdated, a box in your closet never opened because it seems like nothing. I'd encourage you to look again. The most overlooked things in our lives are rarely worthless. They're usually waiting for someone patient enough to finally pay attention. If something in your family has been quietly waiting for you to notice it, tell me in the comments below. I read everyone. And if this story moved you, subscribe, because more are waiting to be told. The end.